The Valley of Death, Ia Drang and the Birth of Helicopter Warfare. Listen up. November 1965. Ia Drang Valley, Central Highlands of Vietnam. That's where everything you thought you knew about war got thrown into the meat grinder and came out the other side unrecognizable. Before Ia Drang, cavalry meant horses and dust. After Ia Drang, cavalry meant Hueys screaming through the jungle canopy at 120 knots, spitting out soldiers into a firefight that would redefine how armies move, fight, and die. This wasn't just a battle. This was the laboratory where we learned that speed kills, that mobility is survival, and that sometimes the enemy gets a vote in your brilliant tactical plan. You want to understand Vietnam? You start here, in the valley where 400 Americans walked into hell and came face to face with 2,000 North Vietnamese regulars who had one simple mission: kill every last one of us. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, same regiment that got slaughtered at Little Bighorn 89 years earlier under Custer's arrogant command. Moore wasn't Custer. Moore was a tactician who understood that in war, the side that can reinforce faster usually wins. The concept was simple, almost beautiful in its brutality. Air mobility. Use helicopters to leapfrog over terrain, drop soldiers directly into combat zones, resupply under fire, evacuate wounded while rounds are still cracking overhead. The problem? Nobody had ever done it at scale. Nobody knew if it would work. And the North Vietnamese army, under General Chu He Man, was dug in deep around landing zone X-ray, waiting to test that theory with everything they had. Moore's battalion hit the LZ on November 14th. Within minutes, they realized they'd landed in a hornet's nest. The tree line erupted. NVA soldiers, disciplined and fearless, came at them in human waves, a tactic straight out of the Chinese playbook from Korea. This is where most units break. This is where panic sets in, where command and control disintegrates into chaos. But Moore had done something revolutionary during training. He drilled his men until air assault became muscle memory. He'd built a fighting force that could coordinate artillery, air strikes, and medevac operations simultaneously while taking fire from 3 directions. And when the NVA charged, screaming through the elephant grass, Moore's troopers held the line. Here's what they don't teach you in Staff College. When you're outnumbered 5-1 and the enemy keeps coming, firepower becomes your religion. Moore called in everything. Artillery rained down so close that shrapnel tore through American positions. Napalm turned the jungle into a furnace. B-52s carpeted the surrounding area with ordnance that made the ground shake 3 miles away. And through it all, those Huey pilots, some of the bravest sons of bitches who ever lived, kept flying into the kill zone, bringing ammo, bringing reinforcements, taking out the wounded. They took fire on every run. Some didn't make it back, but they kept coming. That's the thing about helicopter warfare. It's not just about the machine. It's about the men who fly them into situations where any sane person would turn around. The fighting went on for 3 days, hand-to-hand combat in some sectors, bodies stacked so high they provided cover. The NVA threw everything at X-ray, trying to overrun the perimeter, trying to turn it into another Dien Bien Phu. But Moore's gamble paid off. Air mobility worked. By the time the smoke cleared, over 800 North Vietnamese soldiers were dead. American losses? 79 killed. Brutal numbers. But in terms of exchange ratio, the battle proved that a highly mobile, technologically superior force could win against a numerically superior enemy if the tactics were sound and the men were disciplined. But here's the lesson that matters, the one that echoes through every conflict since. Ia Drang wasn't just about helicopters, it was about adapting faster than your enemy. The NVA learned from that valley too. They learned to avoid set-piece battles where American firepower could be brought to bear. They learned to hug close in firefights, negating our artillery advantage. They learned patience. And for the next 7 years, they used those lessons to bleed us dry, one ambush at a time. More won the battle. History would show that Vietnam was a war where winning battles meant nothing if you couldn't win the war. You want to survive in this world? Understand this. Tactics win firefights. Strategy wins campaigns. But wars are won by the side that can adapt, that can learn from pain, that refuses to fight yesterday's battle with tomorrow's enemy. Ia Drang proved we could move like lightning and strike like thunder. But it also proved that the enemy was watching, learning, evolving. And that's the real fight, not the one you're in now, the one coming next. The valley doesn't care how brave you are. It only cares if you're smart enough to make it out. The siege that broke minds, Khe Sanh and the art of holding ground. January 1968. Khe Sanh Combat Base, a godforsaken piece of dirt sitting 3 miles from the Laotian border, surrounded by mountains, fog, and 20,000 North Vietnamese troops who wanted us dead. For 77 days, 6,000 Marines held that base while the entire world watched and waited for it to become another Dien Bien Phu. You remember that name? French fortress in 1954. 55 days of siege. French collapsed, lost the war. General Giap, the same Vietnamese commander who orchestrated that masterpiece of destruction, was now circling Khe Sanh like a wolf around wounded prey. And everyone, from President Johnson to every grunt with a rifle, knew this wasn't just about real estate. This was about will. This was about proving that Americans don't break, even when the shells are falling like rain and the enemy is dug in so close you can hear them talking at night. Here's what a siege does to men. It's not the killing that breaks you first. It's the waiting. It's waking up every morning knowing that somewhere out there, a North Vietnamese gunner has your bunker pre-targeted. It's the incoming artillery rounds, the ones you hear screaming through the air for 3 seconds before impact, 3 seconds where you've got nothing to do but pray it hits somewhere else. The Marines at Khe Sanh took over 1,500 rounds of artillery and rocket fire some days, not a week, not a month, per day. The base turned into a moonscape. Bunkers collapsed, men got buried alive. Resupply became a suicide mission because the runway was bracketed by enemy guns. C-130 cargo planes had to do combat landings, hit the deck, dump their load in under 3 minutes, and claw back into the sky before the mortars found their range. Some didn't make it, but here's where it gets interesting from a tactical standpoint. General Westmoreland, running the show from Saigon, wanted Khe Sanh held at all costs. Why? Because he believed he could turn it into the set-piece battle he'd been hunting for since day one. He wanted Giap to commit his forces, to mass his troops for a conventional assault, so American firepower could annihilate them. Operation Niagara, that's what they called the air campaign. Niagara, like the waterfall, except instead of water it was bombs. B-52s flying missions around the clock, dropping 100,000-ton payloads on suspected NVA positions. Artillery from nearby fire bases firing non-stop. Fighter bombers streaking in low to deliver napalm and cluster munitions. In 77 days, we dropped more ordnance around Khe Sanh than we dropped in the entire Pacific Theater during World War II. Think about that. More bombs than Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Iwo Jima, Okinawa combined, and still the NVA kept coming. The North Vietnamese were playing a different game. They'd learned from Ia Drang. They knew they couldn't win a direct slugfest against American technology. So Khe Sanh became a diversion. While we obsessed over that base, pouring resources and attention into holding it, Giap launched the Tet Offensive, hitting over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam simultaneously. We were so fixated on preventing another Dien Bien Phu that we missed the real attack. Tactically, we won Khe Sanh. The base never fell. The Marines held, but strategically, we got outmaneuvered. Because while we were celebrating our defensive victory, the American public was watching Saigon burn on their television screens and asking the question that would lose us the war. What the hell are we doing here? Now here's the part that should make you angry. After 77 days of hell, after all those lives lost defending that ground, after all that ordnance expended, after Khe Sanh became a symbol of American determination, you know what we did. We abandoned it. July 1968, packed up and left. The official reason was mobile warfare doctrine. The real reason was that Khe Sanh had become militarily irrelevant. It was always irrelevant. We just didn't want to admit we'd been baited into defending it in the first place. Those Marines bled. For dirt we didn't need, holding a position that mattered more for optics than operations. That's the lesson nobody wants to hear. Sometimes the hill you're dying on isn't worth dying on. Sometimes the enemy wins by making you commit to the wrong fight. You're in your own sieges right now, maybe not with artillery, but with obligations that drain you, with battles that don't matter, with positions you're defending because you've invested so much you can't admit it was the wrong fight. From the start, the question isn't whether you can hold. The question is whether holding means anything, because endurance without purpose isn't strength. It's just slow defeat dressed up as determination. The Marines at Khe Sanh did their job. They held the line because they were ordered to. But the generals who put them there? They lost sight of the mission in their obsession with the symbol. You can win every firefight and still lose the war if you're fighting in the wrong place, for the wrong reasons. The Sucker Punch, Tet Offensive and How to Win by Losing, Tet. Lunar New Year, January 30th, 1968. A ceasefire was supposed to be in effect. Tradition, honor, respect for the holiday. And then at 2 in the morning, all across South Vietnam, the ceasefire went up in smoke. 85,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces hit over 100 cities and military installations simultaneously. Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, every major population center. Even the American embassy in Saigon got breached. 19 VC sappers blowing through the wall and fighting inside the compound for 6 hours before Marines gunned them down. You want to talk about psychological warfare, about understanding that perception matters more than body count? The Tet Offensive is your textbook, because here's the thing that'll make your head spin. Militarily, Tet was a catastrophic failure for the North Vietnamese. They lost over 45,000 fighters. The Viet Cong infrastructure in the south got decimated and never fully recovered. By every tactical and operational measure, we won. And yet, Tet was the beginning of the end for American involvement in Vietnam. General Giap knew what he was doing. This wasn't about capturing cities. This was about breaking American will. See, back in the States, the public had been told we were winning. General Westmoreland stood in front of cameras talking about light at the end of the tunnel, about the enemy on his last legs, about how victory was just around the corner. Then Tet happened. And suddenly every American with a television watched the war explode in their living rooms, watched the embassy under attack, watched the battle for Hue drag on for 26 days of house-to-house fighting that turned that ancient city into rubble, watched a South Vietnamese general execute a Viet Cong prisoner point blank on camera, the photograph that became the icon of the war's brutality. The cognitive dissonance was devastating. How could we be winning if the enemy could launch an offensive this massive? Let me walk you through the tactical brilliance of Giap's plan. He knew his forces would get slaughtered. He accepted that. What he understood, what most military commanders miss, is that wars aren't just fought with bullets, they're fought with narratives. Before Tet, the American narrative was progress, stability, eventual victory. After Tet, that narrative collapsed. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, went on television after visiting Vietnam and said the war was unwinnable. President Johnson watched that broadcast and reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." 6 weeks later, Johnson announced he wouldn't seek re-election. One offensive, One calculated gamble on psychological impact over tactical victory, and it changed the course of the war. The battle for Hue is where you see the true cost of Tet. The North Vietnamese took the city and held it for nearly a month. Marines and army units had to go in and dig them out, building by building, room by room. Urban warfare at its absolute worst. You're not fighting in open terrain where you can call in airstrikes. You're inside tight corridors, civilians everywhere, the enemy waiting behind every corner with an AK and a willingness to die. The Marines lost over 140 men taking Hue back. The North Vietnamese lost 10 times that. But every night, American families watched their sons dying on television, and the question became louder. For what? To take back a city that wouldn't have fallen if we'd been winning like they told us. Here's the strategic lesson that transcends Vietnam. You can dominate the battlefield and still lose if you lose the support of the people who sent you there. Clausewitz said war is politics by other means. Giap understood that the real battlefield wasn't in the jungles of Vietnam. It was in the living rooms of Des Moines and Detroit. He turned American public opinion into a weapon. Every casualty report, every burning village, every image of devastation became ammunition against the war effort. The North Vietnamese figured out they didn't need to defeat the American military. They just needed to outlast American patience. You're fighting your own wars right now, and some of you are so focused on the tactical level, on winning the immediate engagement, that you've lost sight of the strategic picture. You're winning firefights but losing the campaign because you haven't defined what victory actually looks like. You haven't asked whether the ground you're taking is ground worth holding. You haven't considered that sometimes the enemy's goal isn't to beat you in direct confrontation. It's to make the fight so costly, so exhausting, so endless that you give up and go home. That's not weakness on their part. That's understanding the nature of the conflict better than you do. The side that quits last wins, not the side with the better guns, the side with the stronger will to endure the pain longer. The Meat Grinder, Hamburger Hill, and the Price of Pointless Objectives, May 1969, APB Mountain, Hill 937. Nobody called it that. They called it Hamburger Hill because that's what happened to the men who fought there. They got ground up like meat. 10 days, 10 straight days of frontal assaults. Up a fortified mountain, held by North Vietnamese regulars who had turned every inch of that terrain into a killing zone. Bunkers, trenches, spider holes, interlocking fields of fire. And at the bottom, American commanders kept sending waves of infantry up that hill because taking it was the mission. Never mind that the hill had no strategic value. Never mind that there was no plan to hold it once captured. Never mind that this was exactly the kind of meat grinder the North Vietnamese wanted. Trading our lives for theirs in a war of attrition, they knew they could win because they had more bodies to spend and infinitely more patience. Hamburger Hill wasn't just a battle. It was a symbol of everything wrong with how we fought in Vietnam. And it was the moment American soldiers started asking the question that breaks armies. Why are we doing this? The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, the Rakkasans, tough unit, airborne. They'd been operating in the A Shau Valley, hunting North Vietnamese base camps when they made contact on Hill 937. Initial plan was simple reconnaissance in force. Figure out what's up there, call in airstrikes if needed, move on. But once they started taking casualties, once men started dying on that slope, the mission changed. Now it became about taking the objective, about not letting the enemy win, about pride and stubbornness and the fundamental military principle that you don't retreat under fire. So they kept attacking. First day, heavy contact, casualties mounting. Second day, same thing. By the third day, it was clear the NVA wasn't budging. They'd been preparing that position for months. They had the high ground, covered approaches, and the discipline to hold their fire until American troops were in the kill zone. Here's what happens in these situations. The decision calculus gets warped. Commanders at battalion and brigade level start thinking about how it'll look if they pull back. They think about their careers, about the after-action reports, about explaining to higher headquarters why they couldn't take a single hill. So they double down. They call for more troops, more artillery, more airstrikes. The hill gets plastered with ordnance. Napalm turns the jungle into charcoal. Trees get shredded by anti-personnel bombs that detonate above the canopy, sending thousands of steel darts down at supersonic speed. And still, the NVA held, because they were dug in, deep, and they understood something we'd forgotten. Sometimes the only winning move is to make your enemy bleed for every inch of ground until the cost exceeds the value. By day 6, the soldiers assaulting Hamburger Hill knew this was insane. They'd seen their friends cut down by machine gun fire. They'd watched medevac helicopters get shot out of the sky trying to evacuate the wounded. They'd climbed that blood-soaked slope so many times they could do it with their eyes closed. And for what? There were no cities on that mountain, no supply depots, no critical infrastructure, just trees, mud, and well-trained enemy soldiers who'd been ordered to hold the position as long as possible before withdrawing. Which is exactly what they did. When American forces finally took the summit on day 10, the NVA had already pulled back during the night. They'd inflicted maximum casualties and then vanished into Laos, where we couldn't follow because of political restrictions. 72 Americans dead, over 370 wounded, and within weeks we abandoned the hill entirely. Didn't even leave a garrison, just walked away from the ground we'd paid for in blood. The firestorm back home was immediate. Senators demanded answers. Reporters published stories with titles like "The Military Plateau." Soldiers started refusing orders, not out of cowardice, but out of understanding that some hills aren't worth dying for. The phrase came into common use. Don't be the last man to die for a mistake. Hamburger Hill crystallized the fundamental problem with our strategy in Vietnam. We measured success by body count and terrain captured, while the enemy measured success by will eroded and political pressure created. We were playing chess while they were playing poker, and we didn't realize we were in the wrong game until we'd already lost too many pieces. Now bring this forward. How many of you are grinding yourselves down on your own, Hamburger Hill, fighting for objectives that don't matter because you've already invested so much that quitting feels like failure? Pouring energy into battles where winning means nothing except proving you could win? The hardest thing in warfare and in life is knowing when to walk away. Not because you're weak, not because you can't take more pain, but because you're smart enough to recognize that the cost has exceeded the value, that you're fighting because of ego, not strategy, that the hill you're dying on is already worthless and the only one who hasn't figured it out yet is you. Courage is knowing when to charge. Wisdom is knowing when to withdraw. Stupidity is confusing the two and calling it discipline. Tunnel rats and underground hell. Fighting an enemy you can't see. Chu Chi. 20 miles northwest of Saigon. Looks like normal jungle terrain from the surface. Farmers working rice paddies. Villages scattered through the countryside. Nothing special. Except underneath, invisible to aerial reconnaissance, invisible to patrols walking right over it, was a network of tunnels stretching over 150 miles, 3 levels deep in some places. Hospitals down there, command centers, weapons factories, living quarters. The Viet Cong had built an entire underground city, and we didn't know it existed until our soldiers started disappearing. Booby traps appearing from nowhere, enemy fighters vanishing into the ground like ghosts. That's when we created the tunnel rats. Volunteers, usually the smallest guys in the unit, who would go down into those black holes with nothing but a flashlight, a pistol, and the absolute certainty that around any corner could be a VC fighter, a booby trap, or a dead end that left them buried alive. You want to talk about psychological warfare? About fighting an enemy that owns the terrain so completely you can't even see the battlefield? Welcome to underground Vietnam. The tunnels. It weren't new. The Viet Minh had started digging them in the 1940s, fighting the French. By the time we showed up, they'd refined the system into a work of military engineering genius. Trapdoors disguised as part of the jungle floor. Ventilation shafts hidden in termite mounds, multiple exits so if you came in one entrance, the enemy could slip out another and hit you from behind. They had underwater passages connecting different sections. They had false tunnels rigged with explosives. They had chambers filled with scorpions and snakes to discourage exploration. And the tunnels themselves were built to Vietnamese proportions, narrow and low, making it nearly impossible for average-sized American soldiers to maneuver. Every design choice was tactical. Every detail was meant to give them the advantage in their own underground fortress. Being a tunnel rat meant volunteering for a job where your life expectancy was measured in missions, not years. You'd get the location of a suspected tunnel entrance. You'd clear the area above ground, then you'd pry open that trapdoor and drop into the dark. No room for a rifle in those tunnels. Most rats carried a 1911 pistol or a snub-nose revolver. Some didn't carry guns at all because the muzzle flash in confined spaces would blind you and alert every VC in the tunnel network to your position. So they went down with knives. K-bar combat knives, fighting blade to blade in the pitch black, 30 feet. Underground, where one mistake meant you weren't coming back up. The Viet Cong respected the tunnel rats. They knew these guys had to be half crazy to do what they did. But they also knew the tunnels gave them an asymmetric advantage we could never fully counter. The Americans tried everything to neutralize the tunnel systems. They pumped CS gas into the tunnels, but the VC had built airtight doors and gas masks stored at strategic points. They tried smoke grenades to map the ventilation system, but the tunnels were so extensive the smoke just dissipated. They brought in German shepherds trained for tunnel work, but the dogs went insane in the confined darkness or got killed by booby traps. They even tried pumping water in to flood the tunnels, but the VC had engineered drainage systems that made flooding ineffective. Eventually, the strategy became demolition. Find a tunnel, explore enough to map the immediate area, then collapse it with satchel charges. But for every tunnel we destroyed, there were 10 more we hadn't found. The Viet Cong could rebuild faster than we could demolish. Here's the operational lesson that matters. The Viet Cong understood their environment completely. They'd shaped it, adapted to it, made it an extension of their fighting force. We showed up with superior firepower, better training, advanced technology, and none of it mattered underground. In those tunnels, it came down to who knew the terrain better, who could operate in darkness and confined spaces, who could turn environmental disadvantages into tactical advantages. The VC lived in those tunnels. We were just visiting. And in warfare, home field advantage isn't just about morale. It's about knowing every inch of ground, every hiding spot, every escape route. It's about making the terrain fight for you. You're fighting your own invisible enemies right now, problems you can't see clearly, obstacles hidden beneath the surface of your life, threats that appear from nowhere and disappear before you can respond. And some of you are trying to solve these problems with brute force, with overwhelming effort, with the same frontal assault mentality that failed in Cu Chi. You're not asking the right question. The question isn't how to hit harder, it's how to understand the terrain you're operating in, how to adapt your tactics to the environment, how to stop fighting the way you want to fight and start fighting the way the situation demands. The tunnel rats who survived weren't the biggest or the strongest. They were the ones who learned to think like the enemy, to move like the enemy, to understand that sometimes victory isn't about conquest. It's about survival. The enemy you can see is dangerous. The enemy you can't see owns the battlefield. Learn to fight in the dark or die in the light. The last chopper out. Fall of Saigon and knowing when the war is lost. April 1975. The war was already over. We just hadn't admitted it yet. North Vietnamese tanks were rolling south, swallowing territory faster than we could draw lines on a map. The South Vietnamese army, the ARVN, was collapsing. Not because they lacked courage, not because they didn't know how to fight, but because they'd been trained to fight an American-style war with American logistics and American air support, and all of that had evaporated after we pulled out in 1973. Now, it was 1975, and Saigon was about to fall, and the only mission left was getting Americans and selected Vietnamese allies out before the city got overrun. Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. 19 hours of non-stop flights, pulling over 7,000 people off rooftops, while artillery rounds landed in the streets and chaos consumed the city. That iconic image you've seen, the helicopter on the rooftop with desperate people climbing the ladder. That wasn't the American embassy like everyone thinks. That was an apartment building on Gia Long Street. But the image represents the same thing, the end. The moment when you realize all the blood, all the sacrifice, all the promises, they amounted to nothing. The war was lost. Let me take you back to understand how we got there. Paris Peace Accords, January 1973. We signed a ceasefire agreement that everyone knew was fiction. The North Vietnamese agreed to stop fighting. We agreed to withdraw our forces. And in private, everyone understood the deal was temporary. The North would wait until we left, then finish what they started. President Nixon promised South Vietnam continued air support if the North violated the ceasefire. But Nixon resigned in 1974 over Watergate. Congress cut military aid to South Vietnam by 70%. And the North Vietnamese, watching all this from Hanoi, recognized what we'd known all along but couldn't say out loud. South Vietnam couldn't survive without American support. It was a client state, dependent on our money and our military for its existence. Once we left, the clock started ticking. The final offensive began in March 1975. The North Vietnamese hit the Central Highlands first, testing ARVN's response. The collapse was immediate and catastrophic. Units that had fought bravely for years suddenly broke and ran. Not because they were cowards, but because they could see the writing on the wall. Their government was corrupt and dysfunctional. Their leadership was incompetent. Their supplies were running out, and the Americans who'd promised to support them were gone. By early April, North Vietnamese forces were pushing toward Saigon, and refugees were flooding the roads, hundreds of thousands of people fleeing south in a desperate attempt to escape what they knew was coming. The roads became killing zones. North Vietnamese artillery and aircraft strafed the columns. People died by the thousands. And in Washington, politicians argued about how many Vietnamese we could evacuate without it looking like a panicked retreat. Ambassador Graham Martin refused to believe Saigon would fall. Even as North Vietnamese artillery rounds started hitting the airport, even as the South Vietnamese military evaporated, Martin insisted we had time. He didn't want to start a mass evacuation because it would cause panic and make the collapse self-fulfilling. So we waited. And waited until April 29th, when it became undeniable. The North Vietnamese were at the city limits. The airport was under fire. The only way out was by helicopter. Martin finally gave the order. Start the evacuation. White Christmas. That was the code phrase they played on Armed Forces radio to signal all Americans to get to designated pickup points. Bing Crosby singing White Christmas in 90-degree heat while the country collapsed around us. The absurdity would be funny if it wasn't so. Tragic. The Marines who flew those helicopter missions were something else. CH-53s and CH-46 lifting off from the embassy compound and designated rooftops all across the city, flying overloaded, taking ground fire, landing in zones that weren't secured, pulling people up and racing back to ships offshore before turning around to do it again. Some pilots flew over 20 missions in those 19 hours. No sleep, no breaks, just flight after flight while North Vietnamese forces closed in. And on the ground, thousands of Vietnamese who'd worked with us, who'd believed our promises, were being left behind. Not because we didn't care, but because there wasn't time, wasn't space, wasn't a way to save everyone. The Marines had orders to prioritize Americans, then Vietnamese with American connections, then whoever else they could fit. The heartbreak of choosing who gets on the helicopter and who gets left to face whatever comes next. That's something that haunts people for the rest of their lives. The last helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof at 7:53 in the morning on April 30th. Hours later, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. The war was over. 58,000 American dead, over 1 million Vietnamese dead, North and South combined. Billions of dollars spent, years of national division and trauma. And in the end, the outcome was exactly what it would have been if we'd never been there. Vietnam unified under communist control. The domino theory proved wrong. The war that was supposed to stop communist expansion in Southeast Asia ended with us running for the helicopters while our allies got left behind. Here's the lesson you need burned into your brain. Knowing when to quit isn't weakness, it's strategic clarity. We should have left Vietnam in 1968 after Tet, maybe earlier. Every year after that was just delaying the inevitable and piling up more bodies. But we couldn't admit we were wrong, couldn't accept that the war was unwinnable. So we kept fighting, kept dying, kept telling ourselves that victory was possible if we just tried harder, committed more resources, gave it one more year. That's not determination. That's sunk cost fallacy dressed up in uniform. The hardest order a commander can give is the order to withdraw. But sometimes withdrawal is the only tactically sound decision. Sometimes you lose. And pretending you haven't just makes the loss more catastrophic when reality finally forces you to face it. The warrior who knows when to retreat lives to fight battles that matter. The warrior who can't admit defeat dies defending ground that was lost before the first shot was fired.